We don't need late-night panic emails. Jackson, stand down until morning. That was the message. Timestamp. 3:07 a.m. sent directly from our CEO. I remember staring at the screen longer than I should have. Not because I didn't understand what he said, but because I did. At 2:52 a.m., I had sent the most urgent escalation email of my career. Not a guess, not a theory, a clear warning. Subject line, critical failure risk, immediate action required. I listed everything. 3 core systems already showing early signs of breakdown. 2 major client pipelines at risk within 6 hours. Projected financial exposure, $3.8 million before noon if nothing changed. I even mapped out the sequence. Step by step. What would fail first? What would follow? How long each stage would take? This wasn't panic. This was pattern recognition. 18 years of it. And still, his response was one line. Stand down until morning. No questions. No call. No request for more detail. Just dismissal. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the control wall in front of me. Rows of monitors. Most people wouldn't understand what they were seeing. But I did. The red indicators weren't random. They were early signals. Quiet ones. The kind that only show up if you've lived inside a system long enough to recognize when it's about to break. And I had. My name is Jackson Mercer. I'm 47 years old. Senior Infrastructure Operations Lead. I had been with the company for 18 years at that point. I didn't manage people. I managed the systems that kept the company alive. The things no one talked about in meetings. The parts that didn't show up on slides. The work that only mattered when something went wrong. And right now, something was about to go very wrong. I opened the logs again. Cross-checked the same sequence I had already reviewed twice. Nothing had changed. If anything, the signals were getting stronger. A memory hit me. Not from that night, but from years before. A smaller failure. Same pattern. Same delay in response. Back then, we caught it just in time. This time, we wouldn't. I typed one more message. Short. Direct. No emotion. Understood. Standing down per instruction. Logged risk remains active. I hit send, and then I did something I had never done before. I stopped. Not because I didn't care, but because I'd been told not to act. For 18 years, I'd stepped in before things broke. Fixed issues before anyone noticed. Protected systems people didn't even know existed. But that night, I wasn't going to go beyond my authority. If leadership wanted to treat a system failure like a morning problem, then it would become a morning problem. I sat there in silence, watching the clock move forward. 3:15 a.m., 3:28 a.m., 3:41 a.m. The first alert shifted from yellow to red. Right on schedule. No surprise. No panic. Just confirmation. I didn't move. Another alert followed. Then another. Each one exactly where I said it would be. The room was quiet, but the system wasn't. It was speaking clearly. The same way it always had. The difference was no one was listening. Not anymore. And for the first time in my entire career, I'll let it happen. Because sometimes the only way people understand the value of something is when it stops working. And by sunrise, it wouldn't. People think systems run on software. They don't. They run on memory. On patterns. On the quiet decisions made by people who have seen things fail before. I was one of those people. When I joined the company, I was 29. The systems were smaller then. Simpler. Fewer clients. Fewer layers. Back then, you could still see how everything connected. I built my role from the ground up. There was no manual. No clean documentation. Just problems that needed solving. So I solved them. Over time, I became the person people called when something didn't make sense. Not the obvious issues, the hidden ones. The ones buried under layers of updates, shortcuts, and quick fixes. I knew where things were fragile. Not because someone told me, but because I had been there when they broke. I helped design parts of the infrastructure most executives didn't even know existed. Not because I was trying to be invisible, but because that's how the work was structured. If everything runs smoothly, no one asks questions. And for a long time, everything did. I trained managers who later became directors. I explained systems to executives who would nod in meetings and then simplify everything into slides. I didn't mind at first. That's how companies grow. Different roles, different focuses. But over the last few years, something changed. It wasn't sudden. It was slow. quiet. Experience started losing value. Not openly, not in a way anyone would admit, but you could feel it. Decisions started moving faster. Not better, just faster. Risk discussions became shorter, simplified, sometimes skipped entirely. And then came people like Ethan Cole. He was 32, MBA, clean resume, spoke well, moved fast, the kind of person leadership liked. He joined as a strategy lead, but within months, he was sitting in rooms where decisions were made about systems he had never worked on. At first, I tried to help him. I walked him through how our infrastructure actually worked. Not the version on paper, the real version. The dependencies, the weak points, the things you only learn after watching failures. He listened, at least in the beginning. But then something shifted. He stopped asking questions, started making statements instead, simplifying things that weren't simple. We can streamline this. We're overcomplicating the process. This is legacy thinking. I had heard those phrases before. They always sound good in meetings. They just don't work in real systems. I raised concerns. Calmly, clearly, not to block progress, but to prevent mistakes. But over time, my input started getting filtered, delayed, reframed, ignored. Not directly. No one ever said, "Jackson, we don't value your experience." Instead, it showed up in smaller ways. Meetings scheduled without me. Decisions made before I was informed. Plans finalized before risks were reviewed. And when I did speak, the room felt different. Not hostile, just distant, like I was slowing things down. 18 years of knowledge reduced to caution. I didn't argue. That's not how I work. I stayed consistent. I documented everything. I flagged risks. I supported the system. Because at the end of the day, reality doesn't care about opinions. Systems either work or they don't. And I had seen enough to know when they were about to fail. The problem was fewer people were willing to listen when I said it. That 2:52 a.m. email wasn't the first warning I sent. It was just the last one before everything became visible. And the truth is, by the time I sent it, the failure had already started. They just couldn't see it yet. But I could, because I had been watching the same patterns for 18 years. And patterns don't lie. People do. Or sometimes they just choose not to see. But the system always tells the truth. Eventually, the warning I sent at 2:52 a.m. didn't come out of nowhere. It came from a meeting the day before. A meeting that, in hindsight, told me exactly how this was going to end. It was held at 4:30 p.m. on the 18th floor. Executive conference room. Glass walls. Long table. 12 people inside. I wasn't supposed to be there. Not anymore. But one of the directors had asked me to join just for technical clarity. That's what they called it when they needed answers, but didn't want you involved in decisions. I took my usual seat near the end of the table. Not central, not visible, close enough to hear everything. The CEO opened the meeting with numbers. Cost reduction targets. Efficiency goals. A push to modernize operations. Then Ethan Cole took over. Confident, clean, prepared. He walked through a presentation that simplified our entire infrastructure into 5 neat blocks on a slide. Clean arrows. Clean timelines. Clean assumptions. It looked good. That was the problem. Because the real system wasn't clean. He proposed removing what he called redundant safeguards. Backup processes. Failover delays. Manual checkpoints. Things that slow systems down. Things that also keep them from collapsing. We're carrying too much operational weight, he said. We can streamline this within 60 days. No hesitation. No acknowledgement of risk. Just confidence. The CEO nodded. A few others followed. Then someone asked the question I knew was coming. Jackson, do you see any issues with this? The room shifted slightly. Not toward me, but just enough to acknowledge I existed. I didn't rush my answer. I leaned forward, looked at the slide, and spoke clearly. Yes, I said. There are risks. No emotion. No resistance. Just facts. I explained how those redundant safeguards weren't redundant. They were layer protection built over years of real failures. I walked them through a simple sequence. If you remove this layer, I said, pointing to one block, you increase load pressure here. That triggers instability in the transaction queue. And once that happens, recovery time increases from minutes to hours. I paused. which means if something breaks, it doesn't fail small. Silence. Not disagreement. Just silence. Ethan smiled slightly. Not openly dismissive, but confident enough to challenge. With respect, he said, "That sounds like worst-case thinking." He turned to the room. "We can't build systems based on fear. We need to move faster." There it was. That word. Fear. 18 years of experience reduced to fear. I didn't react. I had heard it before. "I'm not talking about fear," I said. "I'm talking about observed behavior. This system has failed before. These layers were added for a reason." He nodded, like he understood. But he didn't. "I think we're overestimating the risk," he said, "and underestimating the cost of doing nothing." The CEO leaned back in his chair. Then he said something I won't forget. "We can't keep operating like it's 10 years ago." Not loud, not aggressive, just final. The room went quiet. No one challenged him. No one asked for more detail. No one backed me. And in that moment, something shifted, not in the system, in the room. My voice didn't carry the same weight anymore. Not because I was wrong, but because I didn't fit the direction they had already chosen. I sat back in my chair and stopped speaking. The rest of the meeting moved quickly after that. Timelines were approved. Changes were accelerated. Responsibilities were assigned. And I noticed something else. My name wasn't included. Not in the execution plan. Not in the approvals. I was present, but not part of it. After the meeting ended, people stood up, closed laptops, and walked out like it was any other day. No tension. No urgency. Just progress. Ethan walked past me on his way out. "Appreciate your input," he said. Polite. Controlled. But empty. I nodded once. Didn't respond. Because there was nothing to say. Later that evening, I checked my system access. Certain permissions had been adjusted. Not removed completely. Just limited. Enough to keep me operational. Not enough to let me intervene. That was new. And it told me everything I needed to know. They didn't just disagree with me. They had already decided to move forward without me. The 2:52 a.m. warning wasn't a debate. It was the last attempt to prevent something I had already seen happen before. And by the time they ignored it, the outcome was already set. At 3:41 a.m., the first system failed. Exactly where I said it would. It wasn't dramatic. No alarms going off across the building. No one running into the room. Just a quiet shift in the logs. A delay that shouldn't have been there. Then another. Transaction queue latency increased by 18%. Then 27%. I watched the numbers climb in real time. Still no calls. No messages from leadership. Because as far as they were concerned, nothing was wrong. Not yet. At 4:03 a.m., the second system started showing instability. Data sync delays between two core services. Minor at first, then growing. That was the point where, under normal conditions, I would step in. Adjust load distribution. Trigger fallback processes. Slow the system down just enough to stabilize it. But those options had been restricted, and I had been told to stand down. So I did. Not out of spite. Out of instruction. I documented everything. Timestamps. Error rates. System responses. Clean. Professional. Complete. At 4:26 a.m., the first internal message came through. A mid-level operations manager. "Hey Jackson, are you seeing delays on the transaction side?" I read it. Waited a few seconds. Then replied, "Yes. Monitoring active. Logged under incident channel. No escalation. No extra action. Just acknowledgement." 5 minutes later, another message. "Should we trigger fallback?" That question would normally come with authority. This time, it came with uncertainty. I looked at the system again. The answer was yes. But the decision wasn't mine anymore. "Recommend reviewing with senior leadership," I replied. Short, controlled, and for the first time in my career, incomplete. By 5:02 a.m., the system was under real pressure. Queue overflow began. Once that starts, recovery gets harder. Not impossible, but slower. And the longer it takes, the more damage builds. Still no call from the CEO. Still no acknowledgement of the 2:52 a.m. email. I leaned back in my chair again and watched it unfold. Not helpless, just no longer responsible beyond my scope. At 5:18 a.m., the third system failed. That was the turning point. Client transactions began failing in batches. Not all at once. but enough to be noticed, enough to trigger concern. Internal messages started increasing. Different teams, different questions. What's going on? Is this a known issue? Who's handling this? I responded to each one the same way. Clear, professional, limited, incident active, awaiting escalation alignment. No assumptions, no overreach, just facts. At 5:47 a.m., the first external signal hit. A client system flagged delayed processing. That's when things move from internal to visible, from manageable to serious. I checked the original timeline I had sent in my email. We were right on it. No deviation, no surprise, just execution. At 6:05 a.m., I finally saw movement. Senior leadership activity increased in the system logs. Access requests, data pulls, internal reviews. They were starting to look, but they were already late. The system didn't care about titles. It didn't wait for meetings. It followed its own rules. And once those rules are triggered, they don't stop because someone decides to pay attention. They continue, step by step, exactly as designed. I sat there, in the same chair, watching 18 years of pattern recognition play out in real time. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, just clarity. Because this wasn't revenge. This wasn't personal. This was cause and effect. And for the first time, I wasn't the one standing in the way of it. By sunrise, they would understand. Not because I explained it, but because they would feel it. In numbers, in losses, in consequences. And by then, it would be too late to stop. By 6:32 a.m., the building wasn't even fully staffed yet, but the problem already was. You could see it in the data first. Transaction failures crossed 11%, then 18%, then 26%. Anything above 10% starts raising flags internally. Anything above 20% starts reaching clients. At 6:41 a.m., the first official incident channel was opened. Not by leadership, by operations. The same people who had been messaging me earlier. I joined the channel quietly. No announcement, no escalation, just observation. Messages were already stacking up. Payment confirmations delayed. Batch processing failing intermittently. Client dashboard not updating. Then came the one that always changes everything. Client escalation, priority level red. That means the issue is no longer internal. That means someone outside the company is now asking questions. And once that happens, time starts working against you. At 6:58 a.m., the executive team finally appeared in the logs. Not in the control room, in the system. Access requests, data pulls, high-level dashboards being opened. They were trying to understand what was happening without context, without history, without the details I had already sent hours earlier. At 7:06 a.m., my phone buzzed. First call of the morning. Director of Operations. I let it ring once, then answered. Jackson, what's going on? His voice was controlled, but tight. I kept mine steady. System instability triggered across 3 core layers. Timeline aligns with the escalation I sent at 2:52 a.m. Silence on the other end. Not confusion. Recognition. You're saying this was already known? Yes. Another pause. Why wasn't action taken? I didn't answer that. Because he already knew. Can you fix it? He asked. That question came faster. More urgent. I can stabilize it, I said. But not immediately. How long? Best case, 2 to 3 hours to contain. Full recovery longer. He exhaled. Not loudly. Just enough to show pressure was building. Stay available, he said. I am, I replied. The call ended. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just urgency. At 7:18 a.m., the internal tone shifted. Messages became sharper. Less discussion. More commands. Who owns this? Why wasn't this flagged earlier? What's the recovery plan? The same system that had ignored early warnings was now demanding answers. I watched it happen without stepping outside my role. I answered when asked. I provided data when needed. But I didn't rush ahead. Because the system wasn't in early warning anymore. It was in failure mode. And failure mode takes time. At 7:32 a.m., a second call came in. This time from someone higher. VP level. Jackson, we're getting hit from clients, he said. What are we dealing with? Same tone. Different voice. I gave the same answer. Clear. Direct. No surprises. Sequence matches the escalation sent earlier this morning. He didn't respond right away. Then he asked the question they always ask when things go wrong. Why didn't we catch this sooner? I looked at the screen in front of me. The same screen I had been watching all night. We did, I said. Another silence. Then a quiet shift in tone. All right, we'll need you on the executive call in 15 minutes. There it was. The shift. From ignored to required. I didn't react. Understood, I said. At 7:49 a.m., the numbers crossed a threshold I had included in my original email. Projected losses, $1.20 million and rising. Not estimated anymore. Real. That's the difference between theory and impact. When numbers stop being projections and start becoming reports. At 8:03 a.m., the CEO finally entered the incident channel. No message at first, just presence. Reading. Scrolling. Looking at the same data he had dismissed hours earlier. And for a moment, everything slowed. Not in the system. In the room. Because now everyone knew. This wasn't unexpected. This wasn't random. This wasn't bad luck. This was a decision. A choice that had been made and now had a cost. At 8:11 a.m., I got the calendar invite. Emergency executive call. Mandatory. And for the first time since 2:52 a.m., my name was at the center of it. The call started at 8:15 a.m. No introductions. No small talk. Just urgency. I joined with my camera off. Same as always. I didn't need to be seen. I needed to be clear. Voices were already overlapping when I connected. What's the current loss exposure? Which clients are affected? Why is recovery taking this long? Then someone said my name. Jackson on. And just like that, the noise stopped. The CEO spoke next. Same voice as the message he sent at 3:07 a.m. But different tone. Jackson, he said, we need a clear understanding of what's happening. Not dismissive anymore. Measured. Controlled. I leaned forward slightly. The system is operating exactly as projected, I said. We're seeing cascading failures across 3 core layers due to load imbalance and removed safeguards. Simple words. No emotion. No blame. Just facts. A pause followed. Then the CEO asked, what needs to happen now? That was the moment. Not loud. Not dramatic. But clear. I outlined the steps. We need to reintroduce load balancing controls, isolate affected queues, and manually stabilize transaction flow. That will stop further escalation. How long? Someone asked. Containment in 2 to 3 hours, I said. Full recovery will take longer, depending on backlog. Silence again, then a different voice. Ethan, I thought those safeguards were optional, he said. Not confident this time. Careful. I didn't respond immediately. Then I said, they were removed. No emphasis. No accusation. Just reality. Another silence. He didn't speak again after that. The CEO came back in. Can you lead the recovery? He asked. The question was direct. But the answer wasn't automatic. I thought for a second. Not because I didn't know what to do, but because I understood what had changed. I can guide the recovery, I said. But we'll need full access restored and alignment on decisions. Clear boundaries. No hesitation. Done, he said quickly. No debate. No delay. Access requests were approved within seconds. Systems that had been restricted opened again. Not because of policy. Because of necessity. I started issuing instructions. Not orders. Guidance. Specific. Controlled. Step by step. Re-enable fallback protocols. Throttle incoming load by 15%. Pause non-critical batch processing. The team moved fast because now there was no room for hesitation. At 8:37 a.m., the first signs of stabilization appeared. Small, but real. Error rates stopped climbing. Queue overflow slowed. That's how recovery starts. Not with a fix, with control. I stayed on the call, but I didn't fill the silence. I didn't explain more than needed, because everything that needed to be said had already been said hours earlier. Now it was just execution. At 9:02 a.m., the CEO spoke again. Jackson, thank you for stepping in. Simple words. Late, but clear. I didn't respond right away. Then I said, I'm doing my job, because that's all it was. Not redemption. Not recognition. Just work. The call continued, but the tone had changed. Less chaos, more direction, because now they were following something real. Not a presentation, not a plan, experience. And for the first time in a long time, they weren't trying to move faster than the system. They were trying to understand it. And that made all the difference. Because systems don't fail because they're complicated. They fail when people pretend they're simple. And that morning, no one was pretending anymore. By 9:40 a.m., the system was no longer getting worse. That doesn't mean it was fixed. It just meant we had stopped the fall. There's a difference. When a system like ours starts breaking, you don't solve it in a single move. You stabilize it. You reduce pressure. You buy time. And time is expensive. By mid-morning, the numbers were no longer estimates. They were real. Confirmed failed transactions. Delayed settlements. Client penalties triggered automatically by missed processing windows. At 10:15 a.m., Finance posted the first internal impact report. Projected loss, $2.6 million. And that was conservative because it didn't include long-term damage. Trust, contracts, reputation. Those don't show up in early reports, but they always follow. I stayed focused on the system because that's what I could control, but I could feel the shift happening around me. Emails changed tone. Shorter, sharper, less confident. No more language about optimization. Now it was about containment, about responsibility. At 10:42 a.m., a message came through from client services. A major account, one of our top 5, was requesting a direct explanation. Not a summary, not a report, a conversation. That's when you know it's serious. Because big clients don't panic easily. But when they do, they don't wait. By 11:08 a.m., legal was involved. Not to assign blame yet, but to understand exposure. Which agreements were affected, which service levels were missed, what penalties could be triggered. Everything I had outlined at 2:52 was now being reviewed line by line. Not as a warning, as evidence. I didn't feel satisfaction. That's not how this works. When systems fail at this level, everyone pays for it. Teams get blamed. Careers shift. Decisions get questioned. And sometimes people disappear quietly from the picture. By early afternoon, the recovery was holding. We had reduced error rates below 5%. Queues were clearing slowly. Transactions were moving again. But the damage was already done. You can restore a system. You can't erase what it cost. At 1:20 p.m., I saw something change in the internal structure. Ethan was no longer on the active threads. No messages. No input. Just gone from the conversation. No announcement. No explanation. But in companies like this, silence says enough. Later, I heard he had been moved off the project. Temporary, they said, but I've been around long enough to know what that usually means. The CEO's early morning message also came back into focus. Not publicly, but internally, referenced in timelines, included in review notes. A single line at 3:07 a.m. Stand down until morning. That line now had weight, because it wasn't just a message anymore. It was a decision, and decisions leave marks. By mid-afternoon, the system was stable. Not perfect, but functional. The kind of stable you accept after a failure. The kind that reminds you what it took to get there. I leaned back in my chair again, just like I had the night before. Same room, same screens, different reality. Because now, everyone could see what I had seen hours earlier. Not because I explained it better, but because they felt it. In numbers, in pressure, in consequences. And that's the part people don't like to admit. Experience doesn't look impressive when everything is working. It looks unnecessary, slow, overly cautious, until the moment it's not. Until the moment everything depends on it. And by then, it's usually too late to ask for it politely. You don't call experience when things are easy. You call it when things are already breaking. And that call always comes at a cost. The system was stable by the end of the day. Not fully recovered, but stable enough that the crisis was no longer growing. People went home that night quieter than usual. Meetings were shorter. Voices were lower. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew what had happened. And more importantly, why. The days that followed were different. Not dramatically. Subtly. Access levels stayed open. Meetings started including me again. Decisions slowed down, just enough to ask questions that hadn't been asked before. No one apologized directly. That's not how leadership works in most places. But behavior changes. And if you pay attention, that tells you more than words ever will. A week later, I was asked to sit in on a review session, not as a participant, as a reference. They walked through the entire timeline, from the first signal to the final recovery. Every step documented, every decision tracked. And when they reached 2:52 a.m., they paused. Not for long, just enough to acknowledge it. The warning had been clear. The response had been simple. And the outcome had followed exactly. No one argued with that, because they couldn't. Reality had already made the case. After the meeting, the CEO asked to speak with me privately. First time since that night. We sat across from each other in a smaller room. No audience. No pressure. Just a conversation. I should have listened, he said. Direct. No defense. No explanation. Just that. I nodded once. Not an agreement. Not an acceptance. Just acknowledgement. Because at that point, the words didn't change anything. What mattered was what came next. We want you more involved going forward, he said. Closer to decision-making. I had heard that before in different forms. Promises tend to come after problems. But I didn't respond right away. I thought about it. Not emotionally. Practically. 18 years. That's a long time to give to a place. A long time to build something that most people don't see. A long time to be necessary but not valued. I'll stay, I said finally. But things need to be clear. He waited. Systems don't fail because they're complex, I said. They fail when we ignore the people who understand them. Simple, not dramatic, but true. He nodded. And for once, I believed he understood it. At least for now. But something had changed in me too. That kind of night doesn't just pass. It resets how you see things. Loyalty isn't about how long you stay. It's about what you're willing to protect. And I realized something important. I had spent years protecting systems. Sometimes, even protecting decisions that didn't make sense. Smoothing things out. Fixing problems early. Keeping everything running quietly. But that night, I didn't do that. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally understood something. If people choose not to see risk, you can't force them. You can only show them. And sometimes the only way to show them is to let reality speak. That doesn't mean you stop doing your job. It means you stop carrying responsibility that isn't yours. You stay professional. You stay clear. But you don't go beyond what you're asked to do, especially when your input isn't valued. Because value isn't something you say. It's something you show. And sometimes it only becomes visible when it's missing. A few months later, things felt more balanced. Not perfect, but better. More questions were asked. More pauses were taken. More respect given quietly. No big announcement. No sudden change. Just awareness. And that's enough. Because in the end, I didn't need recognition. I didn't need an apology. I didn't need a title change. What I needed was clarity. To know exactly where I stood. And what I was responsible for. That night gave me that. Not in a way I would have chosen, but a way I couldn't ignore. Experience doesn't shout. It doesn't compete. It doesn't try to win attention. It just waits until the moment it's needed. And when that moment comes, it doesn't explain itself. It proves itself. Quietly. Every time.